Hello and welcome back to the Christian Century YouTube channel. I'm John, joined today by one of our writers, Francisco Herrera, who has written a new essay, an essay that I loved called Donald McGavran's Complicated Legacy. We are going to dive into the history of McGavran and some of his movement that he started. Before we dive into all that, hello, Francisco. Nice to meet you. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are?
I refer to myself as a freelance deacon for Christian agitation and education. I have been involved in working in the church for intimately for over the last 20 years. In addition to that, I'm also a classically trained violist and orchestra conductor, and I speak four languages. And I also do an enormous amount of fundraising. At heart, I don't know if you can see it from here, but I'm very much an evangelist. I got Jesus on my heart. And so I was very thankful to have a chance to write this article for you.
Awesome. Well, fascinating stuff. Thanks for sharing a little bit about yourself. So I'm quite familiar with McGavran. I was in an evangelical megachurch that their church planting philosophy, I would later learn when I learned about McGavran, was very much in line with some of his teachings and writings. And yet a lot of folks out there watching this video may have never heard of his name before. His most famous idea, I think, which you write about a bit in this essay, is the homogeneous unit principle or homogeneous unit principle. For those out there who have not read about this specifically, can you give us a summary of that idea?
The basic idea, as McGavran would write about, is that people tend to, this is almost a quotation, people tend to prefer to become Christians without crossing racial, ethnic, or class lines or boundaries. And so for McGavran, for whom church growth was so important, first as a missionary in India, he spent the first 13 years of his life in India. He was even born there. And then he spent nearly 40 years of his ministry life, the first part of his ministry life, in India. And so for him, he came up with this idea and developed it for one crucial reason. Was the fact that whereas here in the West, we talk a lot about individual conversions and, having a one-to-one relationship with Jesus, that was very dangerous to do in India because an individual convert from a particular tribe or village or region, one person converting to the Christian faith from Hinduism or Jainism would immediately be a target of reprisals, of death threats, of ostracization. Converting people in groups helped to not only bring more people into the church, but to also keep people safe. So it's important to understand that when McGavran was talking about these things, it was in part because he wanted to make sure that new converts to the faith in India were safe. Another important characteristic to keep in mind about his notion of the homogeneous growth unit is the fact that he not only wanted to convert as many people to the Christian faith as possible for the sake of having more people, but also because in the course of the research that he did among sort of, he would talk about people movements. This was actually a term created by another kind of an anthropologist and Christian thinker in the 1930s in India. But he, in his research on the creation and expansion of the church throughout the world, he noticed that there was a massive interest in Africa and in South America and in Asia, especially from countries that had recently broken away from colonialism or were breaking away from colonialism, to become Christian. And so he wanted to find a way to get as many people to come into the church as possible so he could take advantage of the moment. And much of his frustration with the mainline church was the fact that they weren't really paying attention to any of his observations or any of his ideas. And so I think it's important to talk about that, was that, yes, this idea of the homogeneous growth unit obviously had the disastrous consequences in the US because all of these white Protestants who were trying to run away or in denial of or reactionary against the civil rights movement wanted to find a way to kind of enclose themselves and expand themselves despite the changing ground of the United States. It was at the same time also a pretty sincere effort by someone who really just wanted to share Jesus with as many people as possible. And he put every single effort that he had into helping people to learn this.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. And we're going to dive in a little bit here into both the good and the bad, maybe, of McGavran's thinking. And by bad, I mean potentially unintended consequences of some of his ideas, which you started to describe to us in terms of the aftermath of the civil rights movement and how certain pastors latched onto these ideas. I wonder if you could walk us through some of the ways that this principle about growth units influenced churches in the U.S., church planting, missiology, whatever. What were the ways that this manifested over the course of the decades after McGavran wrote his book, and some of the damage that may have come from that?
There were really kind of two things. The first is just an emphasis on growth, that a sign of goodness and a sign of the presence of God was based on how big your church got and how quickly. There's no support for that whatsoever in Scripture. Um, and as a consequence, that makes, as a Lutheran, I have a hard time with this. This makes then the sign of sanctification, of goodness, of righteousness of a people based upon what we do, as opposed to what Christ has done for us, what God has done for us. Right? That is one of the big negatives. The other thing, and this was a major criticism on the part of especially American and European critics, was that it used culture as a kind of idol, that it was seen as a way to have sort of a basis for outreach campaigns or for marketing or promotion. And so, as such, you were marketing Christ, not proclaiming Christ. And in this way, it cheapened the faith. Um, the I also do, however, think it's important to say that I don't know how much this was unintended on McGavran's part, in part because in very short order, a lot of critics, especially from Central and South America, started coming up and pushing back quite vociferously against him. And he just deliberately deadened himself. He wouldn't listen to them at all. So, never mind the fact that he had spent years of his life a diehard supporter of any kind of racial and economic and ethnic parity and justice, despite his rather firm support of the civil rights movement. When it came to hearing these same voices that he technically advocated for being critical of his baby, he didn't really listen. And this is for decades. So I would consider those to be sort of the negative aspects of it.
Yeah, thanks. And anyone who hasn't read the article yet, make sure you do read the essay because you actually give some stories of those clashes between him and some of those Latin American theologians, and
Yeah.
pretty remarkable. But I wanted to end on a note. One of the things that struck me about this essay is you really were humanizing McGavran and really trying to view him as a person on a journey, good and bad. And I wondered for those who maybe have never heard of McGavran or forgotten him or have dismissed him, what are some things about his ideas that you would commend to Christians today that you think maybe some folks are missing out on?
His complete and utter dedication, not only to sharing the good news of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, but his willingness to carry the cross of other people, and of everyone that was around him. His first real successful evangelistic effort that I mentioned in the article was completely random. It was just because there was a woman who was one of the attendants in his missionary compound that none of the 25 missionaries there had ever shared Christ with her nor her people. And then he just completely of his own accord um, worked to help to figure out how to bring Christ to the Dumar people. And he started off with just a handful of families. And when he came back to the region, he was soon relocated. But when he came back to the region about 10 years later, that number of families had increased, I think, from 4 or 5 to 50. So, and mind you, he did not do this as a professional evangelist. He did this just of his own heart. Another thing and especially why I want to talk about his willingness to sacrifice of himself. I couldn't mention this in the article, but there's a story that I love talking about him. So from 1938 to 1940, when he was on furlough, he came back to the United States and was given permission by his church authority to raise something like 20 or $25,000 to be used specifically towards supporting homegrown evangelism efforts in back in India. So he raises the money by himself, which is, I believe, $250,000 in today's funds. Goes back to India, but very quickly it becomes a little bit tricky to find people who qualified for the grants that had enough of the family networks to develop the ministries. But very quickly, a famine breaks out. And so he spends half of this money that he raised to essentially create jobs, develop public works projects, and to give grants to people so they can continue to be employed, have money to buy food, to pay off their mortgages, and so they don't lose their farms because of famine. And then a couple of years after that, the British Empire clears out a large chunk of people from a certain region because they're afraid that it's going to be invaded by the Japanese. And so he then spends the other half of that money towards supporting these people who were trying to survive British imperial displacement. Again, helping them to pay mortgages, helping them to buy food, creating jobs for people. So he spent all of this time doing his best to raise 2 years, raising a large amount of money for evangelistic efforts. But when he gets there and he sees that the money needs to be used for something else, he does so without hesitation. So I really want people to also understand that. As much as I have disagreements with him, there was in him something that was so dedicated to Christ and so willing to stand up in defense of his neighbors that he really truly lived by that his whole life. And that's something that we can definitely learn from.
Mm, yeah, thank you for sharing that. Again, anyone who missed it, read the essay. The link will be below in the video description. Also, the link to Francisco's Patreon site where you can read a lot more of his work and thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us today, Francisco.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.